Welcome to the Edgevana Podcast, where we illuminate subjects in the IT infrastructure space. Get ready to hear some amazing insights from outstanding individuals that will change the way you think about IT. And now, here's your host, Mark Thiele.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Edgevana's podcast. Today, I'm bringing to you one of my favorite people in the industry and one of the biggest brains in the infrastructure space. And that even limits him because he's spent time with OpenStack and open source in general, et cetera. And always love having a conversation with him, whether it's for other people's benefit or just for mine. Rob Hirschfeld, CEO and founder of RackN. Welcome to the show.
Mark, it's a pleasure to be here. Very excited.
Awesome. You know, Rob, I picked a topic that I believe is important to the audience of Edgevana, right?
Okay.
It's not specifically something I sell, but it's inherent in what Edgevana offers. And I believe it's important to how people consider the projects that are the scale and the dimensions of which are likely to be very different from what people have experienced in the past and have less clear borders for where they will get immediate ROI or where they won't, et cetera. And so it wasn't without some a small amount of coincidence that I thought bringing you on was opportune to talk about that. And so before we get into the direct questions, just give the audience, your, 3 or 4 minute pitch on why, actually what you're doing to some degree and why you also think it might be important to this discussion.
I'm happy to do that. RackN is a 5-year-old software company that specializes in automating data centers. And the thing, sort of the why RackN and our vision here is when we go back to our history, when we were in early OpenStack and early open source days, is that we saw that customers were having a lot of trouble just running their data centers. And we believe that you should be able to run your own data center. Self-management and the idea that you can own your infrastructure, control your infrastructure, sort of central to what RackN does. And we built a product that enables people to have that autonomy, to actually control their infrastructure from the ground up. And that's really the recipe that RackN has come up with, is our software allows customers to manage their data center. And the way we know that that works best is if you start at that physical layer. So server, switch, storage, full life cycle, BIOS, patch, out-of-band management, OS install, right? They sound pedantic, but they're critical to getting things right. Building certificates, managing security zones, getting VLANs, right? Then we install VMware, or Kubernetes, or Windows, or Linux, or whatever you need to make your systems run. We have built standard processes for that, and that's a big part of this. So if we want self-management to work, we have to respect that data centers are different and heterogeneous, and they have different vendors and different network topologies, and that's good. That's normal. And the industry desperately needs this reusable, portable process. So when RackN, software is in a data center, and we're running Fortune 50 companies, right? International banks, service providers, household names that you rely on every day, with thousands and thousands of servers, or down to 4 or 5 servers for some of our customers. But what we're doing is we've made it portable and modular. So you don't have to reinvent, how do I install the BIOS on the Dell server and HP server? How do I install Linux really quickly and resiliently?
Right.
How do I install a VMware cluster in a secure way? Those are standard patterns for us. And we've really worked so that those things become infrastructure as code and reusable, and then you can work from the top above that. And architecturally, that takes a lot of work. It's some real challenging software to build, maintain, and get in the field.
No, absolutely. And I mean, foremost to the audience, I want to just apologize where Rob was talking about weird stuff about like you might be able to do your own thing. It doesn't all have to be in public cloud. We all know it has to all be in public cloud. There is no infrastructure anymore. So I just want to get that clear before we move on.
There is no server. Servers have
right.
gone away.
There are no data centers. There's just cloud functions, and we don't need anything else. But all kidding aside,
your 10-year in the future self is calling you back and saying,
right.
Mark, that's not how the future turned out.
That's
Sorry.
Right. That's right. So thinking about that, Rob, and of course you use the word heterogeneous, and as I might have hinted at relative to Edgevana, it's heterogeneous deployment is sort of part and parcel with what we're trying to provide at the data center level and even at the network level for consumers of our platform. And, when I think about the opportunities that people are now, what are those opportunities, and what companies do you think might be most impacted by these opportunities at the edge right now?
So the most important thing to me at the edge is that we act like it's a new space, and it really isn't. It's on-premises computing and it's operational technologies, but what's happening here is that we're moving into a space where Internet of Things, IoT technologies, sensor technologies, on-premises, artificial intelligence, GPU computing, and low latency interactions, and data locality. There's all these use cases that are showing up where we actually need computing that is on site, on premises. It's not that different than when the PC revolution happened and people realized they didn't want to have these distant data centers with dumb terminals anymore. They actually
Right.
needed much more robust, rich interfaces. And what we're seeing happen with the edge is those technologies are becoming much more critical to business operations, and they're providing a lot of ROI. And so as those operational technologies come in, we're seeing this need to bring IT, the IT technologies, right? The information technologies and the government's policies and the platforms and all these pieces that are more generic and secure, security concerns and management concerns. Those things have to come into those environments also. And so edge is really this next wave of IT technologies just coming into our environments more and more.
And I would certainly agree with that. And I mean, I've used numbers, and frankly, I think I'm being too conservative, which I have a habit of doing, generally speaking, when it comes to numbers. I mean, when I talk about how handsome I am, I'll go with 10. But
Tens,
when I'm going with numbers, then I'll be more conservative. But I get the feeling that somewhere around 15 to 20% of enterprises, large and small, more based on business model than based on a percentage of all industries, are going to find opportunities, real opportunities to leverage edge for differentiation and for market entrance and product deployment, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that number is too high, too low?
So I believe that it's going to come back to, this is going to be really trite, ROI. But what we're really struggling with in edge is cost per device is actually pretty reasonable.
Yep.
Operational cost for those devices is pretty high. So I could get a sensor for $100 and spend $1,000 wiring it in and connecting it up and making it work. That's not a durable thing. And so what we really need to be doing is figuring out how to build systems at the edge where we can actually see an explosion of all these capabilities. Right. Because the alternative is that we build a whole bunch of edge silos. And in that case, you might have a video system and a temperature control system and a voice system and a price scanner system, or whatever components you need. And we're just going to start stacking these up side by side. Yeah. And then having separate teams maintain them and back-ended by different clouds, no data sharing. And to me, when I look at the opportunity for edge, it's about building systems where there's actually crosstalk and data sharing and analytics at the edge. And then the cost of adding a device needs to come way, way down. Yeah. I see all these things coming together, but the idea that cloud has to be involved is getting in the way of that. that pattern.
Right.
And so we need to look at Edge as little autonomous sites where you can plug in an ecosystem of components and then have them share pieces together. And I want to be careful, because that doesn't mean that you're going to have a little rack of servers in everybody's house or at every store location. When we talk about Edge, and I know this is important to you and I, we're talking about nearby computing. You still might have that computing in a secure facility or at some point of presence in a metro area. It's close by latency.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm actually, sitting on the server in order to have my low latency connection.
Right. And I think that's a reasonably good segue into the next question I want to ask about leveraging existing infrastructure. And another pillar, it's starting to sound like I'm advertising for my own company on my own podcast. I'm going to try to cut that back.
Heaven forbid.
But one of the pillars for what it is we are attempting to offer is for customers to be able to maximize the benefit of infrastructure that is already deployed around the world. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, and you alluded to the cloud question a second ago, and I think that's really important because it doesn't just apply to the cloud question. It applies to the largest of the large, focusing on almost any one of the industries or any one of the suppliers in the tech industry, is that we often make boundaries associated with, well, what can we do to stretch Dell to do what we've been doing in one data center? What can we do to stretch Hewlett Packard to do in 20 places that we used to do in 2 places? What can we do with Amazon to cover 10 millisecond latency demand when average round trip for latency to an Amazon data center, even in North America, is at best 40 or 50 milliseconds, and for many 150 to 160 milliseconds. What do we do to approach those markets and leverage existing infrastructure in ways that doesn't break the bank, in ways that doesn't look like we've cobbled together a Frankenstein, right?
Well, first we have to admit that we are going to cobble together a Frankenstein. So what you're hinting at, the opposite side of that coin is the illusion that you can create a homogeneous system.
Yeah.
And so this to me is the place where if your architecture starts with, I'm just going to buy the same unit, or I'm just going to use the same cloud, right, to solve all of my problem, that is a flawed assumption. And so if you step back, and this is what we had to learn when we started RackN. We walked into hundreds of data centers and helped hundreds of customers. Every data center is different. Even if, like, we were at Dell, even if they bought Dell gear, a shipment of Dell gear has material differences on the same pallet.
Right.
From the same vendor, the same model, right? You get used to it. So we stepped back and said, we're not going to fix that problem. And this to me is critical for people thinking about Edge. If you think you're going to fix the problem by imposing a rigor on which hardware you get, or which cloud vendor you use, or what network topology you get, or naming convention, right? Every one of those things is a bad assumption. Right. And so you have to start these designs with, I am heterogeneous from the start. And let me explain why it's so important, because you put this in the frame of legacy infrastructure, existing infrastructure, which, yes, we work really hard to make sure we can automate things that pixie boot, right, when nobody wants to pixie boot anymore. But you got to do it, right? Move to UFI and iPixie, and yes, but one device that can't move, and you got to support both. It's just the way it goes. Right. And here's the thing: it has to be a forward-looking statement, because if you build something today, assuming that you're going to do everything with UEFI boot, or one BIOS or one strategy or one vendor, you can't then move forward if something changes. Like ARM is moving super fast. If ARM comes out with a server that suddenly fits your criteria, probably does already, and you haven't adopted that, then you might be cutting yourself off from a major market supplier. Right. And this has been something in our industry that's just been really tragic, right? We get very used to this, I'm just going to stamp out the same solution a million times. And then we can't innovate, because we can't tolerate the change. And so I 100% agree. We have to fix this problem on the gear you've got, because it's paid for and valuable and useful. And you have to be able to accommodate gear you don't have yet. Right. This is the magic with RackN, is that this is our decision is we are holding ourselves back from innovation when we can only install VMware or we can only install Kubernetes. You have to build something that can install whatever the new flavor of the day is, because you want to build a 10-year vision.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I love the vision. We've probably talked about this, but I like the way you emphasize this relative to, this notion that without actually saying the word, that you're either one, painting yourself into a corner, or to the more modern tech parlance, you are painting yourself into the innovator's dilemma to some degree, right? And you could argue, depending on what your company does and how important the compute is for the company, that it's hard to say that you're innovator's dilemma because you're using Dell gear instead of Supermicro, or instead of a combination of Dell and Supermicro. But the reality for many of us is that we get almost immune to new opportunities if those new opportunities test our assumptions for how we're managing our existing infrastructure and environments. And that immunity is really dangerous.
Correct.
And so, normally when you talk about immunity, it sounds like a good thing, but if you're immune to logic, if you're immune to opportunities to create a new way of moving forward, a new, more flexible way, then I think you are really potentially missing opportunities for your company. And so on that point, Rob, tell us a little bit about, what your thoughts are relative to, the ability to exploit existing infrastructure and what that might mean from a time to value and or an ability to address a market or a wider range of opportunities sooner than you thought you would.
Oh my goodness. So this is a big part of what we try to do. I'll give you some of the development benefits, but we'll also talk about some real cost benefits too. So part of what we see, so let's look at what you and I are both trying to achieve, especially from an edge deployment. Yeah. I have an application that I need to distribute to 1,000 sites. Okay, I can't do it simultaneously. I don't want to do it at once. I want to develop it. I want to test it. I want to put it in 1 or 2 key sites where I can make sure that it works. I want to roll it out to 10%. If that looks good, 20%, right? Rolling upgrades makes perfect sense. That's what we want. This is actually what RackN's built around, is this idea that in edge deployments, everything has to be autonomous. You don't centrally control the edge. It has to all work by itself, but you can influence the edge and you need to watch what's happening. All that's important. And then you need to have a way that you can incrementally make changes to a running system in a coherent way and then test it before you do that, right? It's what you and I have described as a continuously integrated data center, right, is even more essential from an edge technology perspective. And the thing that makes that really hard is that your test gear might be virtual machines, right? Your development gear is probably virtual machines. Your test gear might actually use some of the stuff in the field. Your pre-production environment might actually use the field reference, but the field's going to start aging out and being different, and you're going to have heterogeneity. A new model comes out, and you have all these differences to account for. If you can't handle that environment, right? What we're describing is pretty simple stuff. Right. Then you're in big trouble. Same is going to be true if you're globally distributed, right? Cloud providers have differences. What you have access to might be different, right? With Edgevana, you might be in 2 different providers' data centers that give you the same server, but different network access, or naming conventions are different. These are real, right? These are real differences. They can be really small, but it's amazing the number of times I've seen total deployments fall on their face because somebody changed the naming convention to something that maybe couldn't include numbers or had a dash in it, and their automation just fell down. And there's real money. So one of our customers, we came in, they had 2 vendors. They brought us in because they wanted to add a 3rd hardware vendor because they do reverse auctions.
Okay. Because
they brought in that 3rd vendor, so we were able to make all 3 vendors completely the same. We abstracted a level above them. So I won't name the vendors, but they added that 3rd vendor in. We made them equivalent process-wise. They added to the reverse auction. They saved $10,000 per server.
Jesus.
Okay, that's more than we're charging them by a long shot.
Yeah.
So it only took, that one ability to have some market power.
Yep.
Because we were no longer building to the server specs, but an abstraction level. And so if you think about Edge and you get into a situation where somebody's like, oh, look, we could switch to this new model of infrastructure, or I want to add into this platform, but this platform requires me to run on, Intel instead of ARM or something like that. However you want to slide this up, your ability to respond to that is essential. And it has very real cost concerns and operational concerns. And they're tied together. Right.
No, absolutely. As we're getting close to the end of the program, Rob, I've often been heard talking about the subject of CI/CD, which you just mentioned, which is actually CI/DC. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that acronym or aren't familiar with the idea, the notion that Rob and I talked about in the past, and that Rob just mentioned, relative to a continuously integrated data center. I do have a blog on my LinkedIn page. You can find it there if you'd like to get more thought on it. But I wrote that with a long history of perspective associated with it, right? And Rob, I know you and I have had this conversation before, but for the edification of anybody who thinks that this podcast is still interesting at this point, and I hope they do, because I love this.
More soapboxes to get on. They got to be listening.
Yeah, this is a hugely important topic for so many reasons. But when I was running infrastructure, I never had enough people, right? We never had enough time. And even in organizations that had the money, we were second-class citizens most of the time. And to be able to get the people we needed, without the people, we became imaginative in how we deployed and how we created solutions. But the one area, and this area covers a number of potential issues, but this one area that kept me awake the most at night was going to bed knowing that there were things in our infrastructure that we should be doing, but that we weren't doing. Like, it's sort of like, I've got a lot of wheels on this vehicle. There's a heavy load on it. I know I should stop and check the bearings, but it's a real pain in the ass and I don't have the time because I really need to get there. And so you're riding on those bearings, hoping they don't seize up on you. And when you talk about infrastructure, those bearings are anything from, did you get the firmware update to a specific set of disk drives that you had, and did you deploy it? Did you put that patch on the BIOS to the specific number of Dell servers that you have running? And can you do that in an appropriate period of time without affecting production? And those problems were a real problem with 3, 4, 5 data centers that I had to worry about around the world. Now, I want the people that are listening to think about that from a perspective of, what does that look like if you've got 100 locations? And whether you're solving a problem for a customer that's using your website, your edge infrastructure to supply somebody else with IT benefit, or you are direct to consumer, you cannot afford to tell your insurance agent or your buyer that, oh, that 0-day threat, it takes us a couple of days to update each site, and we have to bring it down for a few hours while we do that. So we'll probably have all 100 sites done in about 3 months on a 0-day threat. You can't do that. That's not an option.
You probably just named an ideal situation for most people, because in the case you're describing, most companies have not worked out the automation to do that work.
Exactly.
And so what they would be doing is they'd be scrambling, they'd be taking people off of critical, ROI projects to run around and patch and manage that stuff as fast as they possibly could. So it becomes this ongoing, juggling of day-to-day operational, the keeping the lights on stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. So here's the ideas that we start with from that perspective, right? And of course, RackN product, our whole infrastructure is code design, is modular and designed to isolate those changes so that you can pick up our tested modules for that and put them into your own workflow chains and not have to worry about, that component as much. But the thing that we've really learned is that this idea of repeatability is a core value to us.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times we look at people automating things and it works once and they don't test the reset. They don't test what the repaving. And what we have learned is that if you can't hit a button confidently and have the environment reset and rebuild and go back into a pristine or go back into the right state, then you have really missed your ability to be confident in that automation. So what you described, that scenario, if you're not confident that you can deploy a patch to all of your infrastructure consistently or rebuild it from, scratch to a known state, or more importantly, from a known state to a known state.
Yep.
If you haven't, right, this is where RackN is really different, because while we're a software company, right, we are really looking to be operational partners with our customers. And we hear this quite a bit, right? We work with them to help them improve their operations, because part of what we've done is we've built an operational philosophy that makes a difference in how people run. It's right, this next generation thinking. And so this idea of repeatable automation, version control automation, where everything we do is delivered right from a Git repo and not ad hoc onto a server and endpoint. That philosophy, the discipline behind that we help customers enforce, is essential to making this stuff work. And by no coincidence, this is the secret, I'm air quoting secret sauce, that the hyperscalers use in their own data centers.
Right.
Right. The thing that I love to say, there is nothing in the water in Seattle that makes Amazon a better deployer. They don't have a secret mineral. They don't have special food, right? They have better process and the investment in automation.
Right. They don't have a secret decoder ring?
They don't have a secret decoder ring. The aliens have not written the tablets of, maybe there is something in Jeff's home that I'm not aware of, but nothing they're doing is secret sauce. It's investment and it's knowledge, it's standard components, and it's accessible to everybody in the market. Right. And I think that's what's so easy to forget is, as they do a great job marketing, it's not your core to be, running infrastructure. It is your core to run. If you're a technology company, it is your, right, or using technology, that is your supply chain. Give up parts of it, I totally get it. We use cloud like crazy. But at some point, especially if you're running edge locations and you're running the store, you need to know that you can manage that infrastructure. And it is marketing that tells you that you can't, not practice.
Right. And I want to, before we bring this to a close, I want to highlight a point that Rob, that you mentioned without calling it out in too much detail. And that's that without saying it out loud, you basically said that if you're working like, crazed sailors at the bottom of a ship trying to empty water that's leaking in to keep your infrastructure running, then you're not doing the things to make your infrastructure better and more protected for future growth and future benefit. And so regardless of how you look at your own labor, regardless of whether you like being a hero and woken up at 2 a.m, regardless of whether you think it's important to your customers that you be able to apply a 0-day patch in all of your locations in a 24-hour period or do it in 6 weeks, keep in mind that when you're out shoveling the snow off the sidewalk, you're not looking at ways to keep the house warmer. You're not looking at ways to keep your guests more comfortable. You're not looking at ways to prepare for dinner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how you need to think about, in my mind, without trying to preach to everyone, in my mind, that's how you need to think about your role all the time as far as what you're providing to your business.
Yeah, SRE would call that toil.
That's right.
And if your job involves a lot of toil, then you are not adding the ROI into your infrastructure that you need to be doing. No, Mark, this is a critical thing. The irony here is that very often the toil gets in the way of people improving their infrastructure. And we do see customers who are stuck, like they'll do a trial, they verify our stuff works, but they never have a window. Their management doesn't create a window, or they don't put the money in to sort of jump into that next thing, because the toil is always keeping them at water level.
Yep.
And then when they're drowning, they're not ready to make a meaningful change. So you have to think about this before you're toiling. And if you are toiling all over and barely keeping your head above the water, find a way to get the life ring and raise the bar on where you're going. The tools.
Right.
A lot of our customers are using 20-year-old tools to solve these problems, and they're never gonna get above water from that perspective, because the threshold of the tool is actually already under their real success point.
Right. So great points, Rob. As always, a real pleasure speaking with you today. I hope the audience took something away from this. I know that, and I'm being honest. I mean, most of my conversations online are not about trying to sell something, but they're about trying to illuminate ideas and challenge assumptions, et cetera. And so I know Rob and I'm just being honest with everyone. I know Rob and I talked a lot about both Edgevana and RackN, but I felt this was my personal decision, so don't blame it on Rob. It was my personal decision to bring this topic to the forefront, because I do think it's so important, and because beyond the fact that I have an enormous soft spot for the data center, which I've spent so much time in and built something of a reputation, even if it's an ugly reputation on data centers, I also spent a lot of time being one and leading those folks that have to be called at 2 o'clock in the morning, that have to toil building servers and fixing things that nobody else appreciates. And what I want for people that were me and people that used to work for me in those roles is to recognize the greater value that they can bring to an enterprise, and recognize that by bringing that greater value, that can mean that their company can approach new markets more quickly, that they can do it more cost effectively, and they can provide an alternative to pragmatic decisions that for me have historically meant picking the lesser of two evils. And I don't like having to be forced to pick the lesser of two evils every time I make an IT decision for my business. So with that, I'm going to do something slightly new. Rob, before I turn this off, our next guest is going to be Amy Marks. For those of you who don't know Amy and you're in the data center space, I would urge you to look her up and look at her experience. She's built landing stations around the world. I mean, like in places that only I knew, because I grew up there, places like Vanuatu in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean near Australia, where I lived for 6 years as a kid. She's done this all over the world. She's a fantastic talent. And now she's doing some of that same work and more with Autodesk. And she's our next guest. So if you have an interest in that topic and you want to send us some questions ahead of time, please shoot us some questions. And we would be more than happy to try and make sure that Amy addresses those in her podcast. But in the meantime, Rob, how can people find you if they want to follow what you're doing online?
So I'm very active as Vehicle on almost every platform. So very active in Twitter. And lately, we've been spinning up this amazing community effort talking about the future of cloud. So if you like these topics, we have a really engaged community at the2030.cloud, where we meet once a week, and we're building up to a summit where we're going to talk about the future of cloud. And we also have a weekly DevOps lunch. So if you're interested in tactical and strategic issues relating to clouds and infrastructure in a non-vendored format, come join us, right? We're having amazing discussions. Mark occasionally shows up and we rope him in, but we've been having just brilliant talks about things that you don't hear anybody else talking about. What would happen if Amazon went away? What happens if the government changes philosophy? You know, are we doing the right thing for humans on the planet? And then we're also talking about like David gravity and adjacency and the economics of how all this stuff works together. You will not hear conversations like that anywhere else, because right, everybody else tries to make it a vendored thing, and we're just having thoughtful discussions like you
That's
and
right.
I have been having
That's
based
right.
on our experience, right? I mean, Mark, I don't think you and I went too far into our products, right? This is our passion areas.
That's right. That's right. No,
and
absolutely. And that's why, that's why I was willing to do it. Cause I'm normally very cautious about anything that sounds like a marketing pitch. But these are huge passions for us, and anyone that knows me at all would know that that's true. But nonetheless, I felt it important to call it out because it is somewhat unlike me. But everything Rob just said, I totally agree with. The Cloud 3030 stuff, the DevOps lunches that he's doing are all fantastic forums for meeting more industry types, but getting real feedback from people that are really practitioners, or even people that are representing interesting products, but they're talking about the market, and they're talking about strategy, and they're talking about opportunity. They're not talking about whether you should buy more HP or more Salesforce or more Google or something like that. So I think it is a really good format. And for me, you can find me at mtlee10 on Twitter. I am fairly active there, and I am always posting topics and articles and looking for discussion on LinkedIn, where I'm probably my favorite place for challenging assumptions, because we tend to get a lot of feedback. So Rob, thanks again for joining. I really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, you too, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Edgevana Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast listening app or on YouTube. To learn more, visit www.edgevana.com. Thanks for listening, and be sure to join us on our next episode.